Hi, I'm Ken Heyman. As Managing Director of the Advisor Institute at AllianceBernstein, I meet with financial advisors every day. One thing I hear expressed over and over is their frustration with how much they are juggling. The advisors I talk to are constantly trying to balance competing priorities, from managing client relationships to prospecting for new business, and of course, the tasks of leading their team. This problem of juggling is why we created the AllianceBernstein Digital Coach. This is a proprietary tool that draws on the wisdom of behavioral economics and unique perspectives from the Advisor Institute's practice management experts. In less than 10 minutes with the Digital Coach, you will be able to identify and prioritize the top needs of your practice. And armed with those insights, you will be well on your way to tackling the challenge of limited resources while positioning your business to seize opportunities for growth. Let the Digital Coach guide your journey to success. Visit abfunds.com/go/digital coach. That's abfunds.com/go/digital coach.
Welcome to this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman. Ken, I'm excited for today's podcast because I'm bringing this question to you. We are living in an age where there are technological innovations, AI and others, that when I look at them, they are both interesting to me. I mean, really interesting in what they can do in my world. And at the same time, I feel really challenged by them. I mean, to the borderline of being scared by them. And I don't think the way I'm approaching it as just the generic old guy in the industry is any different from the way a lot of our listeners are approaching that. So from your perspective, when you hear someone like me say, yeah, this is really interesting and I'm also really scared, what's going on?
Well, what's going on is a normal human reaction to the problem of change for the human the central nervous system. And you've summed it up, as usual, very wisely. You know, on the one hand, there's this attraction, there's this efficiency, there's these benefits, there's this buzz around various technologies as they emerge. And on the other hand, for most human beings, and actually we can measure how many human beings, that the feeling that accompanies that sense of change is not one of excitement, it's one of dread. Only about 2.5% of the population, actually of any given human population, is positively oriented to new things or to the fundamentals of change. Most human beings prefer to learn how to cope with the world and then use that learning, to secure themselves and to prosper. And this goes all the way back to Paleolithic times. It's really woven or hardwired into our central nervous system, Scott, that the experience of the world is full of obviously momentary challenges, but our physiology and our central nervous system evolved in relatively stable ecologies. So by the time you were 13 or 14 or 15 years of age, you had mastered the coping skills to deal with the momentary challenges, and you would pretty much use the same set of skills and the same technologies, the spear, the bow and arrow, whatever it was you were, working with at that point, for your entire life. Innovation happened very slowly, and only a small number of humans were ever very innovative as part of their central nervous system. Now, that number of innovative human beings has increased dramatically as the population has increased. But as Everett Rogers showed us in his famous book, The Diffusion of Innovations, the distribution of innovation, or truly novelty-seeking humans, is actually very small. It's about 2 to 2.5% of human beings. Everybody else needs to get used to the idea of adopting a new technology. Now, a couple of things have happened that are unique to our modern culture, and then something that's very unique to being a financial advisor that we need to include here to really understand the challenge. And as you say, we're all kind of looking at stuff and saying, ooh, that's really interesting, how exciting. And yet at the same time, underneath that is this sense of dread, this sense of, it can feel like exhaustion, it can feel like depression, it can feel like helplessness, it can feel like confusion. There's lots of ways we cope with that negative feeling. But it is this balancing act, as you point out at the very beginning, these two conflicting feelings. Well, the first of these two unique phenomenon has to do with the acceleration of change. If you go back and look at the speed of adoption of technologies over the last 200 years, let's say going all the way back to the adoption of electricity, to get to 50% of the population of the United States to get to having electricity took decades. For 50% of the population to get television took years and years. Radio took longer to get adopted to half of the population. Technology took shorter. I think technology was like 23 years after it was introduced for half the population owned a TV. But as you get closer and closer to the modern era, the speed with which technology is approaching us, new ideas are approaching us, is accelerating dramatically. And this has to do with the fact that as technology is advanced, technology advancing actually increases the speed of technology advancing. So from an idea to a prototype to engineering to production used to take a decade. A new car design was a decade in development. Now it has to be done in 2 or 3 years to keep pace. And as you get the transmission of ideas or information going through larger and larger pipes and more efficient programs receiving it and more efficient distribution of ideas pushing it out there, you get this massive virtuous acceleration of idea development and a virtuous acceleration of change. And so when you look at the speed with, say, a newer technology like generative AI, how quickly it went from, hey, we're making some early breakthroughs to, oh my goodness, we've made this commercial, was actually a matter of a couple of years. You can measure it in months. And the next iteration is going to be even quicker. So an author by the name of Ray Kurzweil described this acceleration in his book, The Singularity is Near. And anyone who's interested in really understanding the acceleration of this should read both Everett Rogers' book that was published in the 70s, The Diffusion of Innovations, and then Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. But what Kurzweil is saying sums up your words, Scott. And that is, as we get enough acceleration where technology starts advancing so quickly that the next development is happening before we can even think about adopting the most recent development, and the next one after that, and the next one after that, to the point where change is so quick, so rapid, humans have trouble keeping up. And the culture that emerges, the way we do business, the way we interact with each other, on the other side of all that change is so fundamentally different that we can't actually predict it from where we're sitting. Now that drives humans crazy, because that's like a human being leaving their stable ecology on the Serengeti plain and all of a sudden stepping over into the land of Eskimos before there are any Eskimos and having to reinvent yourself in an incredibly new hostile environment. Humans just don't do that. They need this gradual process of evolution and development. Now, you add one more piece to it, Scott, and that's unique to financial services, and that is financial advisors have grown up in a technology-enriched environment, but they've seen over the years technologies introduced that did not catch on, ideas introduced that actually had fundamental flaws that meant they were not worthy of adoption, or organizations moving toward issues before those kind of technologies had evolved adequately. And advisors, because they're operating such a challenging business and the dynamics with the humans are consuming so much of their decision-making bandwidth and the dynamics of the market, the financial advisors, unique in terms of their business culture, have limited cognitive capacity left over to say, oh, okay, I'll adopt that technology, I'll adopt that technology. And having seen things show up and not evolve or not become established, advisors are reluctant to respond quickly to new ideas. Again, there are a few advisors, that 2.5% that we call the vanguard adopters, the very, very early adopters that are always going after the newest technology, and it's sort of woven into them, their kind of personality style. The vast majority of human beings are not that way, and the vast majority of advisors are very reluctant to invest time, effort, and energy on something unless it's absolutely certain that it's going to create value for them. To your point and the way you framed it, it's a real catch-22. There's a lot of exciting things happening, and Scott, more exciting things happening in any given period of time than ever before in the history of our industry, than ever before in the history of our culture, than ever before in the history of the world. So lots of things to be excited about, lots of positive developments, and at the same time, a lot of strong emotions that keep us from being able to move toward those new exciting developments and apply our energy to them with a kind of commitment and enthusiasm.
So I heard two different things that I need you to help me get through. Thing one I heard is that the fact that the technology I'm considering is not evolutionary, it's revolutionary, is what makes it so frightening. And the second thing I heard is that there's not a Steve Jobs inside of me waiting to break out. I just haven't found the right button. I'm just not that person. So for the listeners that find themselves in the same place and find that revolutionary piece of software or technology or whatever efficiency is that they want to adopt, and there isn't just a magic elixir I can take to make me open-minded Steve Jobs, Bill Gates person, what do you do? What do you do when you see it and say, I want to get that in, but the fear just locks you up?
Well, there's two things you have to do to overcome that process, and neither of them is easy to accomplish, but neither of them at the same time is beyond the ability of anyone who has the competencies and the capacity to be a financial advisor, which is in my opinion, one of the more challenging occupations there is, that calls forth a high level of intelligence, both raw problem-solving intelligence and emotional intelligence, requires a lot of personal discipline, requires self-motivation, all the stuff that makes great performers noble beings, in the sense that they are authoring their reality. They're authoring the business that they're running. They created the business they're running, and they've been facing challenges on their own and with their own creativity and guile for their entire career. It's the nature of the beast to be a financial advisor in that way. So if you have that capability, you can overcome this challenge, but it's going to require two things. Thing one, you're going to have to respect the natural limitation of your cognitive capacity to adopt new things. And that means to start to be gentle with yourself and say, you know what, I get up in the morning and I read the reports and the analysts, and I see the emerging this and that. And I start to think, well, maybe I should get one of those battery walls for my house and go all in on electric vehicle. And then maybe I should really grab this generative AI. And, I have a colleague of mine who's what you call an early adopter of technology. He's named his generative AI co-pilot. It has a name, and they have conversations because he's so far down the road with experimenting with this thing. Or I'm thinking of my daughter, who's next generation from me, obviously, my daughter. She told me the other day she wouldn't dream of writing an email or even a full business proposal without first starting with her generative AI co-pilot and seeking input from that. The other day, she had a problem with her air conditioner. She asked her generative AI before she called me to help her diagnose the problem. So you see this kind of stuff out in the world, and you see people down the road on their learning curves, and you can start to feel like, oh my goodness, I'm falling behind, and I have to grab all of it somehow. That's a mistake. You are falling behind, but we are all falling behind. No human being can keep up with this. People are selecting what they're going to utilize, and some people have a higher appetite for adopting new things than others. And those who have that higher appetite aren't able to do other things. They are easily bored, and they're constantly seeking the new thing. And so for them, there's a downside to that personality trait. Don't underestimate the power of your own style. And if your own style means you adopt fewer things more slowly, that's great. And start there with an appreciation of that. Then the second thing to do is to spend some time not reacting to your feeling of, oh, I'm falling behind, the fear of missing out, as they call it. So discipline yourself to pull away from that, become cognizant of your own limitations, realize that no one's going to win this race, and that the task at hand is to simply take appropriate steps to move forward. Then if you're thinking that way, then you have to decide, okay, if I can only adopt one thing this quarter and climb the learning curve on it, or one thing in this second half of the year and climb the learning curve on it, if that's my capacity, then I have to decide, of all the things I could do, what is going to give me the greatest benefit and potentially open up other doors for my activity. And again, a suggestion here would be, if you had a choice right now and you had the capacity to adopt one new technology, and I'm just going to pull two just randomly out of thin air. One would be, let's say, go hard into your client relationship management technology software and really rend your business and torque your business into alignment with the intention of that technology. Most people don't use their CRM even a fraction of the way to its capacity and to its benefit. So if you had a choice between that and getting integrated into a generative AI interaction, really understanding how to prompt and how to use generative AI as a co-pilot in decision making. If you had a choice between those two, the CRM is going to be easier, but it's going to limit what you can grow from there with. It's a good thing to do. I would recommend it. And I would suggest, if you had a choice in terms of your bandwidth and the energy you had, I would go all in on the generative AI with the time you have and the energy you have to master a new technology, because the generative AI is going to take you in a lot of other different directions, and a lot more is going to be built off of it. And so the potential is at some point for your CRM utilization to be subsumed under a generative AI manager. In other words, that the vision for generative AI, which every advisor really, I think, needs to understand, is that instead of operating with multiple apps and lots of different technologies that you learn one, and that is the generative AI, and it controls everything underneath it from there and is the intermediary between you and the other technologies. So in that way of thinking, taking the time to climb the learning curve on the more complex technology is going to be the optimum beneficial for you and will be the best way for you to engage your emotions. Now, I haven't in any way advised between those two that you should make the choice. I have some thoughts about that, and I've kind of laid that out. But the point is, if you are going to engage creatively, positively, and productively, it's going to require you to accept that there's a limit to what you can learn. And then in that limit, pursue with intentionality where you're going to get the greatest bang for your buck. And I can't emphasize this too much. Don't get distracted by everything else that's going on around there and all the new bright and shiny, interesting things that will call your attention, because they're going to keep coming. What you want to do is invest your time wisely, understanding that everyone has limits, and use your time within those limits to the greatest leverage you can.
What I hear there is, quit beating myself up about this. It's truly not doing any good. It is, in fact, counterproductive. And be very thoughtful and intentional about focus on one thing, which leads me directly to the last thing I want your opinion on, because you've got such a different perspective. We hear a lot of people opining on the impact of new technology on a financial advisor's practice, but I think that they're all efficiency experts, right? They're all technology people, which is great. It's an interesting perspective. But for a behavioral science-based human who thinks about the psychology of the advisor in practice management context, are there places that really intrigue you as far as a place an advisor might start looking at adoption of some of this revolutionary technology?
Well, there are. And one caveat here, I am not a technology expert, and I am not a financial advisor. I am an observer of both. And I am an interpreter of human behavior in that context. So it is something I've thought about. I think each individual, each financial advisor in the modern era really has a responsibility to themselves and to their business to be intentional about how they will adopt technologies and leverage technologies so that they stay current, and if possible, they can potentially even become competitive by the way they're adopting technology. So let me suggest some guiding principles or some directionality here. And Two of those right out of the box would be this idea of how do I become competitively enabled? And that is that I think the advisor should be looking at those large trends that are emerging into the culture in terms of where the best practices of advisors are beginning to emerge and how those trends should influence the design of your business. And I'll give you a couple of examples in this regard. One of the big trends I see, and something that technology is enabling, but that does require an advisor to adopt the learning curve and be able to interpret to their clients, is this idea of tax-sensitive investing. The idea of maximizing return in the context of taxation requires technology for you to be able to do it in a predictable and in a productive way. Well, now we have whole groups of architects, some of which are part of our firm, that I've talked to about this, and they're saying, look, the technology really is at the point where we can, with reliability, navigate the tax consequences of investing in such a way that it benefits the client and that the client is harvesting the benefits if they're using these technology-enabled approaches to investing. And we're talking across the board from fixed income all the way through equity investing and all different flavors in there. I think this is an area that advisors really need to be exploring. As daunting as it's going to feel to start out with, and as anxious making as it may feel to be technology dependent, I think the benefits that are being produced and the value that is being created gives advisors in this space a competitive advantage. I increasingly see in the psychology of the high net worth and the ultra high net worth client a deep impact into the negative of tax consequences and a deep desire for tax consequences to somehow be managed. Now, this brings me to the second guiding principle, and that goes back to our philosophy at the Advisor Institute about what are the issues that clients bring to their advisor in terms of the client's curiosities or needs as they express themselves in the relationship. So we have this model, as you know, of the 7 inevitable questions that every client has of their advisor. And some of those questions give you great insight into what technologies you should be adopting. For example, one of the questions that clients have is, are you paying attention to what's happening in the world, and do you know what to do about it? Well, the question, do you know what to do about it, grows out of the sense of, I need to know you're advocating for me, and you're advocating for me at the highest level. Beyond what I know to ask for, I need to know that you are ahead of the curve there. So moving toward that tax-sensitive investing that's technology-enabled gives you a way of answering that question. Are you paying attention to what's happening in the world? Do you know what to do about it? Are you paying attention to what's happening in my life? And do you know what to do about it? These are big questions that by adopting this technology, you can begin to have experiential answers for, and you can have something to talk about that's right at the heart of what the client needs. Another question, for example, is, can you give me a compelling reason to believe that the future I want is the future I'm going to get? Well, I've been involved to some extent or the other with driving stochastic modeling, Monte Carlo-based financial planning into the industry since the year 2000. So I've been on this for a quarter of a century, and I am very positively disposed toward the value of being able to use a Monte Carlo-based planning tool as the common vocabulary between the client and the advisor, so that the client can actually have the answer they're looking for, which is, if we've quantified what my future looks like, we can answer the question, what's the likelihood of that happening? And we can answer it to a great extent in terms of statistical likelihood. Well, that's a completely new way of having a conversation with a client for most advisors. And yet this technology has been around long enough, and increasingly people are adopting it enough that it will eventually, just like a CFP designation, will become almost a requirement for being able to be at the top edge or the best practices edge of your practice. So that's just two really available technologies that are going to require a learning curve, that will require the advisor learning how to introduce a new approach to their clients, something obviously we can talk about on another podcast. But right out of the box, those are two things that I think advisors would benefit from considering. Now, let me, as a way of maybe, just bringing it to closure around this whole generative AI thing, the generative AI is a technology that the advisor can leverage to create additional experiences that answer those questions. So if we use our 7-question model, that we believe that every client is bringing questions to the advisor, one of which is, do you get me? Do you get the uniqueness of who I am? And one of the observations we make at the Advisor Institute is that if you have experiences that are unexpected, surprises, and then they're surprises to the positive, it magnifies the impact of the experience the client's having. In the same way that if you have an experience and it's a surprise to the negative, it impacts in the same way. So we always advise advisors, never let a client assume that there's no such thing as a loss. Always prepare the client for a loss so they're never surprised, because the surprise will magnify the impact. Well, one of the things you can do for a client that will be utterly surprising is to gift them. And many advisors do this. They budget a small amount of money to gift their clients each year. They buy a bottle of wine or a book or something. And in fact, I was in an advisor's office the other day, and he had read a book and he loved it, and he bought 50 copies and he was giving them to everybody. And it was a lovely thing. And I actually read the book, and it's quite enjoyable to read the book. One of the things that generative AI can do is if you learn how to use it and prompt it, and it becomes your co-pilot, meaning a technology leverage that you're familiar with and you use kind of as second nature. It takes a while to learn how to do that, but that generative AI is very adaptive, and you'll find that as you apply yourself to it, it'll go quicker and quicker. But one of the things you can do is you can describe the human that you want to create a gift for to generative AI and say, hey, can you suggest a gift to me in the $50 range for someone who's like this, and profile them with 7 or 8 or 9 descriptors. What will come back will be a list of gifts. But the thing about the gifts is they'll be fit to the human being in a unique way. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about this in terms of trying to illustrate this idea of surprise and delight and what that gift can mean. So I have a long-standing tradition with my children. Both my children are grown. And from the time they were little, when I would see wildlife, like we were on a hike or driving in the car, and I would see something, oh, there's a bald eagle, or there's a deer, or and so as the kids got older, they would notice birds and things, and they would say, Daddy, what's that? And as they got into their teenage years, I started a little game with them, is that I would make up names for birds that were completely ludicrous. And now whenever they'll send me photos of birds and they'll say, what's this name here? And I'll give them a ludicrous name back. And it's part of our family tradition. And it's lovely. And it's just part of the fun you have in a family, right? Well, for Father's Day this year, my younger daughter found a book of drawings of birds with crazy names that is basically, it's a 200-page book with somebody that made up a whole bunch of names of birds and drew pictures of birds. And it's delightful. And she gave it to me for Father's Day. Everyone listening to me right now can see what impact that would have in the relationship. My daughter is saying, I see you, I get you, this is part of our fun tradition. And that little moment of gifting just brought us that much closer together. This is what the generative AI and the leveraging of technology does. If you have our 7 questions, and they're available from AI in white paper format, and you see these technologies and begin to borrow on these technologies to extend your knowledge and to be able to do things quickly and easily that you could have done before, but it would have taken you a long time, this becomes a powerful way to even more deeply humanize your relationships. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but to answer the question, what's the likelihood I'm going to get the future I want, and be able to use technology to give the answer, there's nothing more human than that. There's nothing more relationally vital than that. To say, look, we're managing your investments so taxes take less of a bite because we know how important this is to you. That's even more human. Here's a gift that symbolizes our connection and me knowing you. And I took the time to figure this out and provided this to you. Even more human. So with that vision in mind, and then some gentleness with yourself and some patience with the process, I think this is a fabulous time to be an advisor and a fabulous time to become more competitive by leveraging the technologies that we've described in the last 30 minutes or so.
Well, Ken, what a great discussion. I'm going to suggest a use case for this podcast. I think this is one that advisors need a bookmark. However you bookmark these things, and when you feel stuck or when you feel like you're beating yourself up because you're behind, you need to pull out that bookmark and listen to this 30 minutes because I think it can go a long way to getting you unstuck. Ken, thank you so much for your time. Listeners, thank you for your attention.